Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dhar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to my newsletter at vasantdhar.substack.com. Hello, and welcome to Brave New World. My guest today is Dr. Uma Valeti, a cardiologist turned founder and CEO of Upside Foods, which is a company that's figured out how to make meat from animal cells in a way that's more nutritious, more sustainable, has less health risks, and is less cruel to animals. Upside Foods received FDA approval for its cultivated meat a few years ago and is now going full steam ahead with scaling production. What was science fiction just a few years ago is now science. Uma, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
I am too. We've been planning this for a year now.
We have indeed, and I've been a big fan of yours ever since I read Paul Shapiro's book, Clean Meat, where he devotes quite a bit of the book, to you and your story. But tell us about your story. I'd like to hear it from you, specifically, where you grew up, what influenced you, people, events, that kind of stuff.
Well, I grew up in India, so I was born in a small town called Vijayawada in South India, and I grew up in a family that loved eating meat, so relevant to what we're trying to do now. And my dad's a veterinarian. My mom taught physics in college. My grandfather was a doctor, and he was in the Indian freedom movement along with Gandhi, and I grew up with absolute adoration for my grandfather, and I always wanted to become a doctor. And that kind of what, led me to the United States because I wanted to train at the Mayo Clinic. And Mayo Clinic was my North Star to come and do cardiology in, and kind of found a path to get to Mayo through lots of troubles and travels to get to a visa to come to the United States, a typical immigrant story where my visa kept getting rejected. And I finally said, okay, I'll give it one more chance, last chance. And I think my visa got approved in the last chance. So that's what brought me to the U.S.
So, you mentioned your grandfather and, his, he was all involved in the freedom struggle. Was he vegetarian?
My grandfather was a vegetarian, yes.
Okay, but not your parents?
No, my parents were not. Yeah. Yes, my dad's a veterinarian. So I grew up around animals all the time, but we grew up eating meat. Every Sunday, the best lunch in the week was the Sunday lunch.
Yeah, so it's something you really sort of enjoyed, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And so you came here and you became a cardiologist.
I did. Yes.
And so, what was that sort of transition, from cardiology to? Are you I'm assuming you're vegetarian.
Well,
now.
I grew up eating meat, and during medical school, I stopped eating meat because as a kid, I. Like I said, I used to look forward to the Sunday meals, Sunday lunch. I used to go to the market with my dad and buy meat and bring it home. And I used to cut the meat with my mom, and we used to cook it together. And so a lot of favorite memories. But I saw how meat came to the table, both like on at a friend's birthday party where the front of the house was celebrating the birthday of my friend. And I walked to the back of the house, and there they were slaughtering the animals to feed the people in the front. So that became a moment of big cognitive dissonance for me. Birthday, enormous happiness in the front, and death day in the back with a lot of sadness. But I kept eating meat. And in medical school, I was in charge of running our cafeteria for all the medical students. And then I went to the market with our chefs to procure a lot of meat. This was like, thousands of pounds. And I saw large-scale animal slaughter. And I'm like, ooh, that's a tough one for me to see how it comes to the table. So I stopped eating meat in medical school when I was 17. And then restarted eating meat only after we at Upside started making meat again from animal cells. So I went through a journey of being a meat eater to becoming a vegetarian to now becoming a meat eater again, but only from what we make.
It's interesting you say that because I've been, I'm from Kashmir. I've been carnivore all my life. And Kashmiri food is very
Yes.
non-vegetarian. My kids' friends grew up enjoying my cooking. I make a pretty mean Rogan Josh. So
I should give you our meat so you can make it.
oh, well, that would be
Yes.
awesome. Yeah, that'd be awesome.
I'll come to New York and we'll cook it together.
Done. That's a deal. And then I was, on a plane from Stockholm to Delhi. I was reading this book by Peter Singer called Animal Liberation.
Okay.
In preparation for my conversation with, an animal rights activist, Maneka Gandhi.
Oh, yes. Okay.
And by the time I got to Delhi, I decided I was not going to eat meat.
My gosh. Okay.
So that book had a huge impact on me, and I told Peter this because Peter was a guest on my podcast last year, or maybe it's been a while.
Okay.
So that had a huge impact on me.
That's a book for history. So I loved the book when I read it. That was after I came to the U.S. and I was looking at all the books available in the field of how animals are raised, and I kind of stumbled across this, and it looks like everybody around me already had read it, and I'm like catching up.
Yeah.
But an amazing book.
Yeah, truly an amazing book. Yeah, I mean, especially how he describes the whole industry.
Right.
You can't read that book and not be affected by it.
Well, I think the thing is, I think Peter also realizes that there's been a small group that was willing to understand it and say, okay, maybe I would wait for a better solution, but the majority have not. The consumption of meat has continued to grow, uninhibited for decades. And I don't see that slowing down. And that's part of the motivation for us also to do what we're doing now.
Yeah, no, I mean, it seems almost like an aspirational thing, right?
Right,
When people
yes.
acquire a certain amount of wealth, they want to eat meat.
Right, yeah.
And I can totally understand that, as a meat eater who enjoyed meat for a long time.
It's delicious.
It is delicious, but the interesting thing is that I don't miss it at all. So it's been several years and I don't miss it at all. The thing I do miss, I stopped drinking coffee and tea about 3 weeks ago for other reasons.
I see.
So I went cold turkey, and I really enjoy coffee and I really enjoy tea.
I see.
So I've had to substitute that with grated ginger in hot water every morning. I guess that's a lot better for me, but I have to admit I do miss coffee and tea, but I don't miss meat, interestingly.
Well, I think you're in the minority of people then.
Yeah. Well, good thing it works for me.
Yes,
So what was your sort of journey towards, the cultivated meat industry, right? You were a cardiologist. Like what made you think that this was feasible? And by this, you can actually describe to me what this is because, the terminology in this industry, there's all kinds of things, right. Artificial meat, mock meat, cultivated meat, clean meat, right? There's all these terminologies.
Yeah.
And some of it is like you're doing cultured meat from cells, where people also produce it from vegetable products, grain, all that kind of stuff. So just clarify for me, what the nomenclature is in this industry, and then we'll go back to the question I asked originally, which is what made you think that this was actually feasible?
Okay, yeah, sure. Let's do this. I think on the nomenclature side, it's evolved because this moved from the realm of science fiction to reality all in the last 8 years. Starting off in 2016 when we did the first demonstration of the beef meatball, and 2017 when we did duck and chicken grown directly from animal cells. There was no nomenclature for this industry because it did not exist, and it evolved from going from descriptions of lab grown, which is mostly in universities and small labs that people were trying to do the basic science of it, to moving towards the industry being called cultured meat because you're growing cells in cell culture, similar to, in biologics and therapeutics where people are using cell culture to develop medicines to save people's lives, to evolving into an industry called clean meat, where the production of meat from animal cells was infinitely cleaner than how it comes from a slaughterhouse, to evolving towards what is now, I think, is the one that is, bringing everybody together to the word cultivated, which is the industry is finding itself and describing itself to people in a way that is immediately intuitive. When someone says cultivated, is you're growing food, you're growing meat, but no one's described that as a field for themselves in the past. So we're also not taking away from anyone, nor are we creating a dichotomy of if our meat is clean meat, then all the meat we are eating right now, what is that? Is it the opposite of clean? So it's not creating those kinds of, dilemmas in people's minds and therefore a needless acrimonious conversation. It's just creating a category saying, look, we think people love eating meat. We also believe intrinsically people love eating meat coming from animals. And because cultivated meat is an industry that's actually growing meat from animal cells, it's a lot more easier transition for people who have been non-vegetarians all their life and want to keep eating meat, but at some level, whether it's conscious or subconscious, wouldn't mind if there is a way to bring meat without a lot of downsides. And I think that's literally the sweet spot for cultivated meat, where we are not giving up the choice of what we love eating, which is meat coming from animal cells predominantly. And at the same time, trying to decrease the downsides that come from meat coming to the table, whether it is for animal welfare, because 70, 80 billion animals are killed every year, and the enormous environmental impact of growing animals, which includes not just the greenhouse gas emissions, although everybody likes to talk about the climate effects of raising all these animals, but there is literally existential risks that we have, whether it's a pandemic risk or a zoonotic disease risk, or diseases that we get from antibiotic resistance. By feeding a lot of antibiotics to animals, we're also growing bugs that become resistant to antibiotics. And as a physician, I've treated some of the most difficult, obnoxious, persistent bugs that would not respond to any antibiotics, and the patients ultimately end up dying. Therefore, I think there's a much deeper story here of avoiding some of the downsides we don't need to. And I've also treated people that come from places where they develop respiratory illnesses, or being in intensely crowded areas, growing, whether it's respiratory diseases from being in chicken farms, or whether it's just being in the community where a lot of these things are discharged into the water pollution. So I do think there's significant upsides we can gain from preserving the choice of eating real meat from animal cells without having the downsides to the community, to the planetary health, human health, and at the same time preserving what we love. The deliciousness of it is a human experience. And that human experience, I think, we need a lot of ideas to feed that human experience, whether it's animals being raised in a regenerative manner or being raised in a way that is as humane as possible, and also plants being converted or processed in a way that replicates that meat experience. I think we need all of these. It's not an either or.
Yeah, and I, and you said earlier that the demand will only grow. A friend of mine actually mentioned casually that if Hindus ate beef and Muslims ate pork, there wouldn't be enough resources to feed the planet. Your
friend is, thinking about possibilities already, which I think are not too far away and distant. Consider the fact that most people think India is vegetarian because of religion. But if you look at India, there's 1.4 billion, and 80% are Hindu, but 70% of that group eats meat, which is, again, almost 800 million people. They don't eat beef, though. But imagine if beef becomes mainstay in India, which I think is going to be a religious hurdle. But if that group wants to be able to get beef on the menu, I do think it's a massive opportunity for cultivated meat, because Hindus do not have to raise animals to slaughter because cow is considered holy. It's possible that cultivated beef, cultivated meat could satisfy that.
That's really interesting. I never thought about that until, now, that Hindus might actually eat cultivated beef, because it doesn't involve cow slaughter, right? And real animals. That's interesting.
Think about that. It increases the market size for beef significantly. Yeah. And for pork, for instance, obviously we haven't looked into any of these, but if there is a way for pork or meats of that nature to be more suitable in cultures where they're traditionally not consumed, I guess there is an opportunity also there for cultivated pork to be able to fill that gap. Or if the demand comes up, or maybe there are people that obviously understand the religious lines there, still have switched over to eating things that maybe are not according to the religious text. I know a lot of Hindus that eat beef, and I'm assuming that kind of opportunity also could exist in pork and of that nature, where they're like, oh, now I have a choice. I don't have to be in conflict with my religion. So interesting possibilities. Your friend is prognosticating very much into the future.
Interesting indeed. So let's roll back to, I think 96 or so that you mentioned that you were at the university. And from then to 2016, when you produced your first, $1,200 meatball, right?
Yeah.
So what was that process, and what made you think of really going into this industry as opposed to, becoming a cardiologist and having that being your profession?
Yeah, it just became a very long, circuitous path of coming and becoming a founder and CEO of Upside Foods from being a cardiologist, because this was not my path that I thought of growing up. But I did realize that when I was in cardiology, I had a couple of really important experiences. One is I was taking care of patients who either had a major heart attack or a cardiac arrest. And I would resuscitate them on the table. We would open up the arteries that were blocked and send them off home saying, look, you died. You've got a second chance at life with the resuscitation and opening up of your vessels. You got to avoid certain things. Don't smoke, diet in moderation, take these medications. And I was completely surprised when a third of the group of patients, almost within a month to 2 or 3 months, started going back to the things that they loved doing. So even when your life is at risk, we are, as humans, are choosing what we love to do, which to me was a profound experience. And the second one then happened in my own work in cardiology, which is I was taking stem cells from patients' marrow when they had a heart attack or a cardiac arrest, and to identify the cells that can be re-injected into their heart to regrow the heart muscle so their heart will become strength, regain the strength it's lost. And as I started doing that work and the procedure, one of the things that dawned to me is, okay, what if we take cells from an animal and we grow this directly into meat? Would that solve a problem? And given that I grew up eating meat and I stopped eating meat for 20 years and I missed the taste of meat, that became one of those questions I kept asking myself out of curiosity. Why is this not happening? Why is this not being done by someone? And starting around 2006 or so, I started talking to everybody I could, saying, why are you not doing this? The underpinnings are there in science. The biology is known. You could take cells and grow them into tissues, into products that we want. We are already doing that in medicine. Why not do it in food? And the more and more I explored, it became very clear it could be done. And the more and more I talked to people who were capable of doing it or had the skills and the knowledge to do it, it also became clear to me that it was a very high risk, venture.
So you figured that it was scientifically possible to do this, that there wasn't a theoretically insurmountable hurdle.
Yes.
So would that have made it then an engineering challenge, or was there still a lot of R&D?
I think there was
involved?
still a lot of R&D to be done to show this can be done. The third experience I had in cardiology, that was, again, really important experiences when I started looking at growing organs for humans and tissues for humans when they were damaged to repair them. And we realized the science was there, but the reason that field was not taking off actively was singularly because the organ or the tissue that you grew from the person's stem cells had to function in that person for the rest of their life, whether it's a 10-year lifetime or 20 or 30 or 50 years. It had to live, breathe, and work for the rest of the person's life. And medicine was going in a very different direction to solve those challenges. And that was a very long way off. That also was very expensive. And then when I started thinking about what are the principles that can be applied to grow food from animal cells to grow meat, one of the big things, and this was not an easy, intuitive thing at that point. I was thinking about it for a while, and suddenly the realization was, these cells don't need to live more than a few weeks. That's all. They have to grow, they have to become meat, and once they're harvested or you stop feeding them, that's the end of their lifetime. they provide the function of food, which is the taste, the texture, the flavors, and then it was done. So we didn't have to solve the scientific challenge of it living forever, which then became a very different challenge now. The engineering challenge at that point was, okay, now can we grow these cells at scale, much larger scale? And can you actually replicate the taste of meat and the textures of meat and bring the cost of production lower? So I thought that was a reasonable chance that we could go after it. And I tried to encourage a lot of people to do it. But it still was a high-risk venture because no one had ever done it before. They've done it in small scale in laboratories to do really expensive demonstrations of saying we can make some goldfish or we can make some, burgers from cow. But it was not going into a commercial, unlock. And I thought when you really want to have an impact, it has to be adopted. Industry has to adopt it and say the science can go and become something significant to, have benefit. So I've tried to encourage a lot of people to go into that space, and nobody was willing to. So long story short, I was complaining about this to my wife and kids, and they're like, Dad, you've been complaining about this for 10 years. Why are you not doing it? And that became the simple call to action. And my wife gave me permission to quit cardiology. So I wrote to one venture capitalist and saying, here's our idea. We've done the basic science in the lab. And we think this is a big idea. No guarantee it'll be successful. But are you interested? And that singular email written,
Who was that?
So the first email I wrote to, and the only email was to a group called IndieBio. Sean O. Sullivan is the founder of IndieBio. He's a very successful entrepreneur. And his life's mission was to bring the best technologies out. And IndieBio is the arm that does biology and food and life sciences. They're the largest funder of this in the early stage ideas. So they invited us to start a small team in San Francisco. So that started my journey from Minnesota to California. This was in 2016.
So what do you think made them sort of believe in this? That, because no one, I'm assuming no one else
I don't think anyone
did.
believed in it.
Yeah.
I think they just thought, what if this idea is actually feasible? I think they were willing to just stop and say, okay, this is actually something substantial. This is an impactful idea if it works. We want to place a small bet on it. So they invited us to put a small bet on it. They gave us $50,000 and said, we'll support your team for 4 months. We'll give you space in the lab and you can work on it.
And what was the objective for those 4 months? What were you expected to?
So objective at that point was the earliest proof of science we could do to show that we could actually grow meat from animal cells. So the singular objective was to say, let's take cells from a cow and see if we can grow, beef out of it. And we did that. In those 4 months, we ended up growing 30 or 40 grams of beef.
So say more about this, right? So yes, so why is it so slow, this process?
Well, I mean, for the 4 months, the first 2.5 months was just basically trying to share space with a number of other teams that were trying to use maybe a 200 square foot area where we had access to the early equipment to do proof of science. And this is where lab comes from. Very, very early idea. You're trying to share space. And we didn't have continuous access to this during 3 months. We had maybe in total access to it for 3 or 4 weeks. We had to get our cells ready. We had to go to a healthy cow, take some cells from the healthy cow. We had to keep those cells, growing. And we had to grow enough to say we can now stop feeding them. And it takes about 2 to 4 weeks to, like I said, to feed and grow these cells to become meat. So 2 to 4 weeks. At the end of 2 to 4 weeks, we were able to grow about 30 to 40 grams. And we said, this is more valuable than anything in the world, like more valuable than gold or diamonds. And we got to make sure that this actually makes a difference for this idea. So what we decided was we took about 4 grams of it and cooked it ourselves to make sure that we knew how it tasted because nobody also tasted it. So I became a complete believer in this when I tasted the first 4 grams of that beef we cooked. We made a small, tiny fajita. And when I tasted that became one of the most important moments or a defining moment for me to quit cardiology because it instantly exploded in my mind, every neuron that kept yelling, this is meat, this is meat. Because, keep in mind, I'd stopped eating meat and I'd tried every meat alternative, plant alternative, algae in my mycelia. But that I've never had that experience where literally every neuron explodes and says, this is meat. When I felt like, okay, this is 4 grams was enough to tell me that I'm eating meat. There is something here. So that's when I called my wife and said, look, I don't think this industry is going to go anywhere. If I do this as a part-time on a sabbatical, I just have to quit. And she said, okay, well,
so that was your moment of truth.
That was a moment of truth.
Just out of curiosity, what was the smell like? Did it smell like meat?
Absolutely. Yeah. I have the video, I'll show you afterwards. It was sizzling, number one. The sizzle is important because you hear it. The color transition that you see it was important. It starts becoming brown with the Maillard reaction. And the aromas start filling the room. And there's no question that the aroma, when you cook meat or put meat on a grill, you could be, 100 yards away or, totally different room, a different floor. The waft of that aroma was what I started smelling. And then when I put it in my mouth, it was just an explosion of like the neurons saying this is meat. So that was unlike any other experience that's why I call it the defining experience, where I became a completely, believer in this and said, this is going to work. We just had to figure out how to do it well, scale it, get people to experience it, because a lot of skepticism exists before someone tastes it, sees how it's made. And I think I felt like this is not just the making of it. It is the experience that people have to feel themselves. And that's well beyond just the making of it, the science of it, or the engineering of it. There's a storytelling to it. There is a connection to our traditions and cultures. I realized that this is just not a science experiment at all. This is actually an innovation that has transformative implications. And I didn't see any other path but kind of committing full-time to it.
So what was the next step from there?
Well, the next step was taking the rest of the 26 grams and figuring out how we could get the most impact out of it. So there's third-party validation. So we decided to do that with a single beef meatball and invited private tasters, third parties to come and taste in a group of like 25 people. We cooked the meatball in front of them. We did not know how it was going to really turn out. And the Wall Street Journal covered it. And we had just one outlet that covered it and 20, 30 people that were able to try a tiny piece of the meatball. The rest was essentially history, where the beginning of the industry, the roots were, being laid, the seed was being sown. This was in San Francisco. And the next steps were to see if we can actually repeat it. And that was the next step. And what we said, again, with very little resources we had, we moved from San Francisco to San Leandro. Hired a team of 9 people. We got the first seed financing that was about $3 million.
And where was that from?
So Sean Sullivan was there, but it also came from an investor in London from CPT Capital called Jeremy Collar. We had a group called New Crop Capital that is now Unovis Capital. We had a few other local, families in San Francisco. There was a number of my family and friends that invested in that early round just to give us a chance. There's a lot of them to name, about 25 family of friends of mine that invested in it. And that gave us the early chance. So we actually set up our own space, shared with one other company, not 14 other companies, and used that as a place to say, let's show that this actually works as science in other species. We've done cow. Now let's see if cow is a mammal. Right. We said, what are the 3 most commonly consumed meats in the world? It's chicken, number 1 by a distance, followed by pork, followed by beef. So we said, let's do a completely different species. So we said, let's do birds. We did chicken, which is the most popular meat in the US and also the world. And then something very regionally specific. We did duck, which more duck is eaten in China than the rest of the world combined. But let's see if we can do it in chicken and duck. And we did the demonstration in 2017. And we had the same thing. We grew, I believe at that point, not 30 grams, but we grew about 3 or 4 pounds in total of that. And we did some testing on our own, felt convinced that this is great. And then we did one big cooking in what used to be Julia Child's kitchen and invited the Wall Street Journal. We asked them to bring their own tasters. They brought 2 or 3 independent tasters. And we cooked in front of them something called Southern fried chicken. Fried chicken is the most eaten chicken in the world. And we did something which is a very special dish called duck l'orange. which was one of the specialties of Julia Childs. We cooked it in that fashion, and we trialed that. And again, the experience was mind-blowing. And the Wall Street Journal wrote about it again, starting to show science is progressing. It's being de-risked in multiple species. So it was still at that point proving of science. The first chapter was all about proving that the science worked.
So that was your first company. Was that Memphis Meats?
Yeah, our company when we first started was called Memphis Meats. And the company is the same. The people are the same, but we changed the name of the company from Memphis Meats to Upside Foods.
So what's the story there? What was the name change motivated by?
Well, I think we started recognizing that this was truly kicking off global interest and a movement, because when we started in this space, there was no companies. We were the first company. By the end of 2016, there were 4 companies. By end of 2017, there were 17 companies. And then by end of 2018, there were like 45, 50 companies. We started seeing that this was becoming global, and companies were starting in every country or every continent in the world outside of Antarctica. So we're like, when we went out and started talking to people in Europe and Asia, they didn't know why it was called Memphis Meats. They asked us, "Are you from Memphis?" And then many of them did not know what the city of Memphis. And some of them thought it was Memphis, Egypt, which was 2,000 years ago, where a lot of ideas and original trade came from. So we're like, look, we want to talk about the idea of what we're bringing forward, not the name. So we're like, let's pick a name that is immediately going to project our intent to the world. And it became Upside Foods, because our intent is to bring upside to food production and upside to, things that we care deeply about: human health, community health, and animal health.
And what year was that you changed the name to Upside to?
2021.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what's happened since 2021 at Upside Foods?
Well, a lot has happened. Half of our lifetime has been during COVID. We didn't anticipate COVID coming and becoming a pretty big blindside for all our growth plans in 2020. What happened was the following. People started recognizing these pandemic risks are real. It's not only things we talk about from 1917, the Spanish flu, but this could actually be real. It could be life-threatening to us. And we did talk about cultivated meat being an opportunity to decrease the pandemic and zoonotic risk even well before 2020. But no one paid attention. It was like fine print. It suddenly became really clear that, this is a real and present danger. So I think a lot of people just took up notice and saying, look, cultivated meat may be more expensive now, but ultimately they started seeing that this is going to have to be a part of our toolkit, so that when supply chains are broken or when we cannot feed people, but we have to be able to continue to adapt. This is one of those things we should be prepared for and invest early, because the cost of investment is so little compared to what we're able to gain from it. And therefore, I think innovation capital started seeing that this was important. So suddenly 200 companies came out of this, during COVID. And there was an explosion of companies in this space. So lots of companies got funded. And I think that was too many companies, because this field is also not ready for so many companies, because it's very capital intensive to grow it. So what we did was we raised 2 rounds of financing, one in 2021 and one in 2022, to be able to fuel the growth, to show that we can show scale of engineering, very large production systems. So nothing we do now looks like a lab. Unlike in 2016 or before, where stuff was done in the lab. Now the work we do is all in clean production facilities, where we're trying to grow food just like you would go in a brewery, where beer is brewed, where yogurt is made in large, steel clean tanks. We can now show people what it looks like. And not only can we offer the experience of tasting meat, but we can offer people the tour of seeing how it's made. And we built a production facility not far from here, 5 minutes from here.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, I visited that last year.
Oh, yes.
So I remember seeing that facility, and I was sort of intrigued by the smell around the facility. It's been a year now, so I don't remember it, but I sort of am sensitive to smelling things, because I was particularly curious about that. But yeah, it seemed like a regular sort of facility. I mean, it could have been brewing beer or whatever. These big tanks and industrial.
It's in the middle of a city, literally. Yeah. I mean, we are flanked by coffee shops, we're flanked by restaurants, we're flanked by food trucks. It's a children's park, a dog park, very dense urban housing, and right there in the middle of all of it, you're making meat. So I think that's the experience we wanted to create, saying that meat production does not have to be on the outskirts or pretty far away where nobody can see it or smell it. It could right be in the communities, so you can reduce the transportation from the time you make meat to where it goes to the point of consumption, whether it's a restaurant or a supermarket. So this has become a very clear demonstration project to people across, the US as well as the world to see, hey, there's a transition that you can see it, visualize it, taste it, and experience it. And that's what has happened since 2021. We built the place. As of now, we're actually expanding to make it tenfold larger, to open it in the middle of next year. We also got regulatory approval in 22 and 23, which is one of those transformative things, again, for an industry that didn't exist. So the second chapter, which is proof of safety and proof of regulatory approval, has been completed between 2021 to today.
Now, you're regulated by both the FDA and the USDA.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So say a little bit more about that. Like, what does the USDA do and what does the FDA do as far as you're concerned?
Just stepping back, in the United States, food is regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, which is the FDA, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is the USDA. Most of the food we eat is regulated by the FDA, except when it comes to meat and poultry and certain agricultural commodities, where the USDA has gained this enormous experience of how is meat processed and packaged and labeled in front of consumers so they understand what they're eating and how cleanly it's produced and processed. Whereas the FDA has gained a ton of experience in trying to see how can animals be raised in a healthy way and how could you have the best possible ingredients make its way into the food system. So they both have complementary experiences. As it comes to us, the analogy is in the US, a live animal is regulated by the FDA. Once the animal is slaughtered, it is regulated by the USDA to make it into animal products that go into food. The analogy for us is as the animal cells are growing in our production facilities, that is regulated by the FDA. Once we stop feeding the animal cells, that is akin to killing an animal and harvesting it. So once that happens, where you stop feeding the animal cells, it goes into the USDA's jurisdiction, and then they look at how is that made into a meat product, whether it's a chicken fillet, whether it's a steak, whether it's a meatball or a burger or chicken tender or a nugget, all of that. So that's how it comes together in the United States.
Yeah. Oh, so the regulation actually is almost identical to meat,
you can
right?
say that. Yes. Yeah.
Same thing. Interesting. And so you've got regulatory approval from both those agencies.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's awesome. Congratulations.
So thank you. Yeah. So that was our second chapter and third chapter. The first chapter was proof of science. The second chapter was proof of safety. And the third chapter was proof of regulatory approval by the most credible regulatory agencies in the world, which is FDA and the USDA. Now we are into our fourth chapter, which is proof of scaling. And I think that's what we're intent on showing, that we can scale cultivated meat production to a place where it could become commercially viable and different entities, states, countries, and also industries can start investing in trying to build a cultivated meat production facility in their zip code. And we're trying to lay the foundation for that to start happening.
So let's talk about scale. The facility that you have close by here that you're increasing by tenfold, what sort of volumes are you expecting when this thing reaches steady state?
Scale is a word that is relative when you talk about meat, because if I step back, just taking chicken in the United States, 34 billion pounds of chicken is made in the United States and consumed every year, which is the equivalent of raising 10 billion chickens every year and slaughtering them. So each chicken makes about 3.5 pounds. So roughly it's 35 billion pounds. What we are trying to show as the demonstration here is to show that we can make, what does it look like to make 1 million pounds of chicken product, and the economics of making that 1 million pounds when it's scaled to producing 30 million pounds, 50 million pounds, or 100 million pounds, what does it look like? That's the transition point we're going through. And that's what we intend to show in the production facility that you came and visited. And once that ability to show consistent production of millions of pounds is done, that is, I think, when we get our badge of credibility, saying that these guys have truly transitioned from being a science experiment to showing that they're safe, to showing that they have a good process, to showing actually that they can make it commercially viable. So that's the most important chapter to actually have impact. So I think when this is demonstrated in the form of availability to a consumer in thousands of restaurants in the US and if a few retail stores here and there, our goal is to be able to say by the next 5 years or so, we can start getting the mind share of people to say, cultivated meat, I get it. It's meat growing from animal cells. Instead of raising and slaughtering an animal, we can get meat to the table by raising an animal cell. I think that is all the education we need to do in the next 5 years, backed up by ability to produce and show how the economics of that will work for people. And that's the chapter we're in.
So talking about the economics, what do you project the price point to be relative to, meat that you get in stores these days? Will it reach the same price point, or do you think it'll be...
Well, I want to acknowledge, look, I think the reason I'm in this is to bring the price point to just as accessible as possible for any meat sold anywhere in the US and also outside. That's the reason that I'm in it. That's the reason why Upside Foods is in it. But it's also clear that this is very hard to prognosticate exactly when a technology will get to be mass scale based on the price of commodity products. But what I know for sure and for certain is that what we're targeting is to get it into the hands of as many people that can experience it with or without a price premium. When there is a price premium, we think about organic. So organic meats are well established as having a slightly more premium price than commodity price. So I think a reasonable target for us that we're going after is to be able to be in the range of organic meat pricing. Maybe there's plus or minus 25% here or there, but that's our target on what we're going after. And I believe that the demonstration facility that we're building and expanding in Emeryville is going to be able to show that. The next step after that is really to show how quickly can you get infrastructure financing to be able to build much larger scale facilities where you can get another 50% reduction in cost, because the difference between premium organic and conventional is approximately 50%. So if we can get that, that is going to be completely a function of scale. How much infrastructure financing can go into it? How well and robust can our supply chains be? Can I have a supplier that will give us the vitamins and minerals that we need to feed the cells, or the proteins that we need to feed the cells at a lower price? So creating competition in the market so that the producers that are now producing for the animals, so the animals are fed, can also say, now I have a totally new market, a market where I can get a higher price for the plant-based products the animals are eating. Animals are eating plant-based products. Animals are vegetarian for the most part. The same product they're selling for the animals, they can increase the spec and the quality of the product, and they can sell to this cultivated meat industry. So there's a market creation that needs to happen. As that happens, I think, if there is no major political hurdles or funding hurdles, I think that sweet spot of when we can get to conventional price parity is between 5 years and 15 years from now.
Wow, that's really interesting. What are the biggest challenges you see to achieving scale, right? Because the objective here is to get to scale as fast as possible. And clearly the fact that you expanded tenfold means that this is now, well underway to establishing scale. What are the sort of challenges and barriers you're facing, and what have been some of the surprises?
Well, for an industry that is innovating and is very capital intensive, one of the things to acknowledge is capital is a huge barrier. Getting funding is a huge barrier because this is high risk financing. There's no risk appetite during certain parts of a cycle. Right now, there's not much risk appetite.
Why is that?
I think there's a lot of uncertainties in the world. People are worried. And when there is that much worry about where money is going, I think people are putting it in much safer, lower return areas and not taking as much risk as they would otherwise take, saying that I have some buffer here. And I think the buffers have decreased across the world for people in doing capital-intensive infrastructure financing. So that's the cycle we're in right now. So capital is always going to be a challenge. The second one is political involvement versus policy. So there is a significant political polarization that is happening with misinformation that is not helpful for innovation. And I think that's also a cycle. And our goal is to keep the best of our products being experienced by as many people as possible. So we get to be in the rooms where information is being shared. So I do think the two hurdles that I see are funding, and the second one is going to be politics versus policy. I do not see anything else as a challenge. I think the science is amazing. It's going to keep continuing to get better. We will actually be able to evolve to a place where we can make meat healthier and safer for us. I do see that we could make this a solution where eventually when countries are getting behind it, they will be able to think about food security and food safety for themselves versus being very dependent if they're landlocked on getting food from elsewhere, or if they're waterlocked, or they have challenges growing certain types of crops or animals. I do think in the long term that's a major benefit. But right now, in the immediate next 5 to 15 years, I think it's just funding and politics.
But by the way, I forgot to ask you something earlier. Have you done like blind tests with people?
Yes.
Where,
always.
And can they tell the difference?
There are some people who tell the difference, of course, because they are amazing in telling the differences, but the majority cannot.
Interesting.
The majority cannot.
So it's like 90% of the people can't tell?
Depending on the products, yes, absolutely. There are some products, if they're not really at the finish line and then the early stages of development, probably 50-50. But when it gets to the final stage and finished, I'd say 80 to 90% is a very good estimate.
Okay, yeah. I mean, at that point, if you can't tell the difference.
Yes, yeah. I do think that's an important piece where people feel like I'm getting something just as good or better. And that's why getting to scale matters, because we can get this in the hands of a lot of people who can make the judgment for themselves. Because you brought up this blinded tests, we've also done blinded tests of meat versus meat. And it'll be really funny to see that there'll be people that'll vouch and say, that's not meat.
Good point.
Yeah, so I don't think even meat versus meat people will ever get to 100%.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. So, you talked about funding. So this is sort of a bit of a dry part of the cycle, the funding cycle. But, I guess it'll, things are cyclical. It'll come back. Where's most of the funding coming from? Is it coming from like the established players like Cargill and Tyson and, the heavyweights?
Actually not. This is a part that's surprising, which is actually a very good way for us to recognize how important this work is. If I look at our set of investors, the investors that we have include a very big tent of investors. So there are investors who are from the traditional established incumbents like Cargill, like Tyson, who want to be able to have a steady supply of meat for them and have lots of hedges against various things that can happen. They want to be able to feed people. They want to have an established stream that can diversify what's in their toolkit. So we have incumbent investors like that. We also have investors that are actually in the front with the consumer that are supplying products like Whole Foods, like Amazon, chefs. Then we have people that are institutional, certain sovereign wealth funds. So sovereign wealth fund from Abu Dhabi. So the Middle East and North America is a really important area that is looking for food safety, food security. We also have the government-owned entity called Temasek from Singapore, which is also a quasi-sovereign wealth fund, you can say. So that is for the region of Asia. We have one of the largest financiers of innovation that is very interested in this field, SoftBank from Japan. We also have Baillie Gifford, which is the Scottish mortgage fund, and that is also very much European. So, and then in the US, we do have Threshold or DFJ that did the first Series A check for Tesla and SpaceX that is purely focused on innovation. We have a group called Norwest, which is a consumer-facing brand that is invested in lots of consumer-facing brands like Viore or related to shoes and food. So I think we have a variety of people, and we have impact investors also, those who care about things that are important in the world. Richard Branson, who's at heart an entrepreneur who wants to do things that will change the world. We also have people like Kimball Musk, who is a Culinary Institute of America certified chef who likes to grow food. So we do have
any relative of Elon Musk?
Yes, Elon's brother is also an investor.
Interesting. So what are the established players doing in this space? What's their reaction? Like, what's Cargill and Tyson doing, right? So if this is indeed the future and this is their bread and butter, what's their reaction to this? I'd expect them to be investing heavily in this.
Well, I think for them it is, Cargill and Tyson are such large companies and that have multiple divisions as a part of it. And they're slightly different, of course, but they want to be able to feed people really well. And they want to be able to have a steady supply of high quality product that they can rely on. So for them, I think they do have a very large animal protein business. They do have a very large plant-based business. And they have seeds and grains, and they have other things depending on, which company we're talking about. Both of them think of this as a inevitable future or a portion of meat consumption in the United States or globally. So they want to be ahead and be investing to see how can we make this better. So I think they are definitely in it for those reasons. They're not thinking about this as a replacement. They're thinking about this as an and solution, which means we need plants and animals and cultivated.
Now, why is this, right? Because, one of the things, so I'm here on the West Coast, teaching a tech innovation class, right? Yeah. And, one of the sort of frameworks that's so commonly talked about is the innovator's dilemma, the Clay Christensen framework, right? There's so many stories about, heavily entrenched incumbents, who are so confident and powerful and confident about sort of the future of the industry and powerful. And, they neglect upstarts. It's bizarre that you're upside, but they neglect upstarts who have a much lower performance, like let's say a much poorer price point, and they wait too long to the point where they get disrupted, and the demand for the product goes to zero, because a formerly inferior product has caught up to that price point and is now taking off, right? So I'm just projecting, let's say 5-10 years from now, let's say where you've achieved scale, and let's say your price point is competitive with organic meat, or even better than that if you achieve scale, right? At that point, it becomes kind of late to react. So I would expect them to be worried and concerned and saying, look, this is crazy, because clearly the science has proved that this works, right? If people can't tell the difference, then it works. The question is, can you actually produce it at scale and at price point? And hey, these guys seem to be pretty determined to do this, right? And that's what innovators do, right? They're determined, and they push ahead, and they believe in something because it works, and they believe that it's going to continue to improve. So I'd expect them to be worried about this.
Well, I think that could have been a reason why they invested early, so that they are not going to be caught by surprise. But I also know that the work we're doing is not easy. There's so many reasons we can fail. In fact, millions of reasons we can fail, and only a handful of reasons why we'll be successful. In the face of it, we have a team working and saying we are betting with high conviction that we're going to be successful. And when people go through these cycles of, feast or famine, where infrastructure funding is drying up and there's political pressures, I think the safest thing for people to do is to wait and see. And I think they're in a wait and see mode, let's say. But it's up to us now to continue to show the scale is not going to be an Achilles heel for us. I think it's entirely possible what you're saying. When we prove scale is not an Achilles heel, it might be too late for a lot of people who have not gotten into this industry. And that's the golden opportunity for us. And that is also an opportunity for maybe incumbents who are trying to be visionaries and trying to place some bets that are very smart. I would say they should place bets in there. I mean, Cargill and Tyson have placed their bets, but there's a lot of others who have not.
So what does the intellectual property look like in this space, right? I understand it in software, what is it, or even hardware. What does it look like in this space?
Well, there's a lot of intellectual property being created, a significant amount, because we're talking about growing animal cells, feeding them high quality feed, building production facilities that are infinitely cleaner than how meat comes to the table now, and developing products that taste the same, slightly different, but still delicious, or maybe better nutritionally. So, I mean, this landscape of intellectual property creation is enormous because there's a lot of intelligent and exciting ideas that are coming to this table from people who come from a background of farming and food. So I do think there's a lot that's being created. How it's going to be applied in the future, I think it's just not been tried yet. And I have my views on how we want to apply it. But we still have to earn our right to be at the table to say, here's how we think about it. And I think we, for instance, are the company that have been talking about how to bring products to market. We've been very transparent. We are the only company that brings people in and have them come and see the production facilities and have them see the tasting of products that we're making. We telecast our opening through YouTube, and all of our videos are out there for people to see and watch and react to. There's good to it, and there's also downsides to it. But we ultimately feel like we have to get ahead on education and grow along with answering questions of the skeptics. We get punched a lot because people think that we can't do what we are planning to do. But I think through that starts a dialogue. And I think I'm just leaning on the side of dialogue is better than no dialogue. And maybe that's one way we differ from Silicon Valley, in where a lot of things are done in the stealth mode. This industry has never been in the stealth mode from day one because we were the pioneer, and we took a position that we are not going to be in stealth mode. We're going to be talking about what we're working. The first 30 grams we made, we unveiled that in the public eye. The first 3 pounds we made, we unveiled it in the public eye. The first production facility of this kind done in the world, we opened that in the public eye, broadcasting on YouTube. And we put our entire regulatory dossier out in the world to see for the FDA and USDA. So, and we are talking to, the administration, whether it's Obama or Trump or Biden or Trump again, we're talking to the administration on both sides. Not that we get a warm reception every single time, but our principle is grounded in the fact that we're going to keep talking about it. We'll learn from the dialogue. If we make mistakes, we'll pivot and we'll try. But it's not for lack of trying, not for lack of transparency, but we also expect the other side to engage with just as much interest and detail versus just having fleeting interest and coming and writing a quick headline and getting out of the way, which is unfortunately what we've also had to deal with since 2021. There were a lot of quick headlines that came through without understanding the detail and not having the interest or time to get into the nuance of it. And this has come from big outlets and small outlets. So I'm not talking about only small guys do it or only big guys do it. It's just human psychology of moving on without nuance. So that's part of the challenge we have to still deal with while building the airplane and also trying to fly it.
Yeah.
That's the innovator's dilemma.
Right, indeed. See, let's talk about IP. I guess an adjacent question I want to ask is, what's the impact of all of these developments in molecular biology and CRISPR and all of that stuff? How is that impacting this industry, if at all?
I think the developments in molecular biology are fundamental to be able to say that I can see enormous improvements coming to meat, where we can make meat better, safer, healthier, even more than it is now. And I think that's foundational. I think the idea that we are understanding how cells grow and how beneficial parts of the cell can be increased and parts of the cell ingredients or products can be decreased, that's fundamentally important for molecular biology. CRISPR is just a tool, just like a nice, fancy tool. You don't need CRISPR for a lot of things you do. But CRISPR and CRISPR-like things that are coming through, we'll keep an eye on them and see, would that be helpful for us? And if it is, we'll use them. We're not against using any of them. I mean,
in what way could they be useful? Just out of curiosity. And this is, I must admit, I'm relatively ignorant about, the details of the space. I sort of understand how CRISPR works at a high level.
Well, CRISPR or CRISPR-like tools or any innovation in science, if it can do the following, which is it can increase the lifespan of the animal or animal cell. That's amazing. Now, suddenly you have a cell that can live longer. Yeah. So then you can have more production come out of that cell as opposed to retiring the cell early. And I think principles are the same. If an animal can, the animal is going to be killed no matter what at a certain age. But by that time, if the animal is going to be able to gain more weight for less amount of feed, then that innovation is already happening, and CRISPR is actually being used in raising animals. It's also being used in creating breeds of crops that are more resilient to climate change. and also can grow on very little water or grow in saline or saltwater conditions. So I do think as humanity adapts, all these are important tools to have.
What do you see as your, at this point, the biggest hurdles going forward? What are the barriers? What worries you and keeps you up at night?
I think the reason we're going to be successful is because of the people, the innovators that are here driving the industry forward, and getting the best of the best to come and join the industry is the one that is going to get us to solve these problems faster, whether it's problems of scale, problems of access, or problems related to getting away from the challenge of current meat production. I do think there's a huge war for talent going on right now, and there are some industries that are probably more financially secure because they've been well established, for instance, in life sciences or pharma or something like that, or maybe the AI industry that's growing with enormous amounts of capital coming in is attracting talent. We're fighting with these groups to get talent to come and say, do something more meaningful than you can ever do in any of those industries. You can use the tools from those industries, but do something that fundamentally feeds us, that fundamentally provides access to long-term safety and security. So I think, to me, I'm looking to get the best people continuously into our team. And the other ones we talked about are funding. Try to get the right source of funding that is aligned with why we exist is really important. We're not here to kind of say we're going to be a massive financial success in 3 years, but we're going to be a significant success for humanity that will let financial success follow that, in the terms of very similar to what happened with EV, where Tesla has been around for 20 plus years. And the whole ideas of EVs have been around for more than 20 years. Tesla is just one example, but look at what's happening in that EV industry in the US and China. The race has heated up so much that EVs are cheaper than combustion cars. I never expected that.
Yeah.
Right?
And we were at Waymo yesterday, and I realized that they got started in 2009. It's 15 years, right? These things take time, right?
Yeah.
And you've been at this for like
8
20
years now.
Well,
yeah, 8 years, but the idea has been there for 20 years in my head.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. And so you've been running with this at at Upside for 8 years. So yeah, you're reaching that point where you expressed it. It's a question of scaling.
Yeah, and I think getting to 1% of the market share is what I'd really love to see Upside get ourselves to. 1% of the market share of meat in the United States.
In the next...
if we get to the 1% of the meat by 2030, I think it'll be amazing. That's what we're capable, in my mind, of doing, to get to 1% of the market share for meat in the United States. That's 6 years from now. But the two challenges are capital and politics. I don't think it's science or engineering.
Are those the major barriers you see at the point?
That's what I see. If I really look back from 2030 and see what would have let us accelerate, I think it's funding and political support to say this innovation needs to exist in the United States because it's too much of a risk to not have it. And I give you an example of one of the most difficult things for me to sit here and see is the state of Florida trying to ban the production, marketing, or selling of cultivated meat in the state of Florida. I think maybe a short-term win for the state of Florida and maybe the industry that is going to be protected, but it's just such a long-term loss because how could you ban innovation in the United States? This country has been built on innovation, and if the best ideas don't get support here, they're going to go elsewhere. So then we might be looking at ourselves 10 years from now, 15 years from now, when this innovation primarily is being driven from outside the US. It could be China, it could be somewhere else. And we're playing catch up. Catch up is not fun.
So say a little bit more about what actually happened in Florida, because there's Florida and I think another state, right, where there's some major
very
resistance.
Simple. I think, Florida and Alabama have basically said they want to ban selling of cultivated meat in their states.
And the logic is
what? The publicly stated logic was, I'm only paraphrasing, so you can look at the actual source of this, but to snuff out an industry that could be a competition to the existing industry, which is the analogy of saying, let's throw the...
But that's not what they actually say, is it? I mean, I would assume it's based on safety or...
This is an afterthought.
I see.
because they realize that it's politically not correct to say that. Yeah. So then afterthought is to say, oh, we don't know if it's safe or not. Well, let me tell you, as a physician, when we start talking about safety of food and safety of meat and how it's coming to the table, there is an enormous opportunity for us to increase the safety of meat. Because, I think about 25 to 30% of people in the United States get food poisoning every year. And when you look at the source of the food poisoning, a lot of that is going to come from contamination of the food products that in some way are related to how we raise animals, slaughter animals, and transport animals, and the contamination of our food supply with bacteria that grow in animals' guts. That's a large number of people. Like 30% of the United States is like 100 million people every year getting some type of involvement related to food poisoning, and 5,000 die. But it's not fun to get food poisoning. And I do think there's an enormous opportunity for us to not ignore that and saying, can we make the system a little bit better? And I do think, the fact that neither Florida or Alabama talked to us or asked us and said, hey, we'd like to understand a little more about what you're trying to do. Can we set up a call? Can we set up a call with our scientific teams and, our, government officials? It was just done as a blanket ban. And I do think that'll be reversed. And ultimately, we are going to focus on the states that are welcoming us and trying to have people experience it, because when people experience it and go and tell their legislators, this should have a chance in the United States, then they'll be able to understand why it's important, not to ban stuff or kill something before it takes its first steps.
Yeah, I mean, I really wish you huge success. I'm a huge fan of what you're doing, and I believe that this industry will have a transformative impact on humans and equally importantly on animals, right? Because, like I said, it was Peter's book that made me stop eating meat, and it wasn't for health reasons or environmental reasons, which I think are extremely important, but it was just for reasons of animal cruelty, right? That's what really sort of got to me. I could not see myself supporting an industry that imposes that much cruelty at that kind of scale, right? So that has huge impact on me. And so I'm a huge fan of what you're doing, and I wish you huge success. And I really thank you for being on the podcast and sharing your time and expertise and knowledge with us.
Thank you so much for coming here. And like I said, I'd love to cook Rogan Josh in your kitchen. So let's make it happen in New York.
Let's do that for sure. Yeah.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah.